The following program has been pre-recorded, so please don't call in at this time. If you wish to participate in the program, tune in at 5 p.m. every Wednesday for A Pause for Thought on Baton Rouge Community Radio. Good evening, fellow humans. This is Wayne Parker with A Pause for Thought here on Baton Rouge Community Radio, 96.9 FM here in Baton Rouge. Welcome to the show, everyone. And I'd like to give a call out to Mr. Lang Baker, my faithful co-host, companion. How you doing, Lang?
Doing fine, Wayne. Thank you. Glad to be here.
Yes, me too. Glad to be here. Oh, pretty much glad to be anywhere except at work. Anyway, tonight, I want to remind everybody this is a live call-in show. 343-9927 is the number to call. 343-9927. And tonight, although I didn't do a promo about it, Lang and I are going to discuss our views and ideas prompted by the essay Self-Reliance by Ralph Waldo Emerson, who lived back in the late 19th century. He was an American essayist, lecturer, philosopher, and poet who led the transcendentalist movement of the mid-19th century. And he was seen as a champion of individualism. Now, individualism, from when I clicked the link on Wikipedia where I got this, it states as individualism is a moral stance, political philosophy, ideology, or social outlook that emphasizes the moral worth of the individual. Individualists promote the exercise of one's goals and desires so value independence and self-reliance and advocate that interests of the individual should achieve precedence over the state or a social group. While they oppose the external interference upon one's own interests by society and institutions. And I don't see a problem with that to the extent that, I shouldn't be stopped from doing something that harms no one, except maybe me, by the government. Although, and of course, harming others is kind of blurry. I mean, if you behave in a way that could cause the transmission of some kind of disease or whatever to a lot of people, then that might be something either you learn to conform to the laws of society or get out, something like that. But that in and of itself doesn't bother me, but I think he also gives the impression in the essay that he does believe that. But and the Transcendentalist movement was a philosophical movement that developed in the 1820s and 30s, so he did not found it, apparently. He, I guess he could have, 1803 to 1882, so he may have been involved in its founding. But it's compared, Transcendentalism is, a core belief of it is in the inherent goodness of people and nature. Adherents believe that society and its institutions have corrupted the purity of the individual, and they have faith that people are at their best when truly self-reliant and independent. And the more I think about that, the more I kind of understand why it doesn't really exist as a valid philosophy anymore, or as an accepted one among a lot of people. Anyway, Lang, we both took a lot of notes on this. This was about the fourth time in my life that I've read Self-Reliance, and from our conversations before getting on the air here, I kind of realized that maybe I was just taking from what he wrote whatever I understood or that made sense to me, which is kind of like what he's advocating, except that he makes a lot of blanket statements in there. But you have your list of topics that you sent me, and do you have one you want to...
I have a number of quotes there, and a lot of them overlapped with the quotes that you had highlighted as well, and what you sent to me. And
share something that you like, that moves you.
I'll put it more in the category of quotes that are of interest to me, not that I necessarily like them all or don't like them all. Okay,
that's cool. That works.
Well, one of them that struck me from his opening paragraph.
Yes.
To believe our own thought, to believe that what is true for you in your private heart is true for all men.
Yeah.
So what struck me about that is it's making an attribution to everybody, whatever I think is true.
Yeah, and, well, maybe you do. Maybe what I think is right is really what I believe. I believe that it is right for everyone else too, but someone else could always give me a different perspective on why they don't agree, you know, and I might be forced to, you know, and I likely would be forced to change my thinking to accommodate that, if I think that's valid.
Yeah, well, it's interesting. I think that there is a common tendency of people to think that everybody thinks like them.
Yes.
About various things, and to recognize there are other areas where we have radically different thoughts. So there is that tendency to look at things that way. But what I've come to, how I've come to approach thoughts about what's true or not true, I've become more skeptical of myself.
As we get older, I think we do that, yeah.
It's not only do I not necessarily think the other people think the same thing I do, it's also, well, how much trust should I put in my own sense of what's true?
Right. So, but wouldn't that, if you can't ever trust yourself, where does that leave us?
Well, there's different degrees of trust, I guess, and there's different categories of thoughts that we can say to what degree do we trust this or not trust this. Like, I think pretty much all of us trust the sun's going to come up tomorrow.
Right.
You know, but when it comes to what are the underlying cause of things, then it gets more problematic trying to determine how much to trust. I mean, we've gotten into this some in topics where we talked about psychology and trusting our senses and whether what we perceive is accurately reflecting what the universe is out there. And part of that from those discussions is the idea that, well, our sense organs are attuned to certain kinds of energy inputs that other animals have different ranges, for example, of sensitivity to the electromagnetic fields or to the light spectrum or to touch or other sense organs, and some can sense things we don't, and vice versa. And so when we try to say, well, what's the world out there, and do we trust our interpretation of the world, we're limited in a certain sense. No pun.
Yeah, no, I agree, and I guess until talking to you about this, none of this, my mind did not rebel against most of what he writes. I look at it more, I guess, is that if I'm certain of something, as certain as I can be, recognizing that I might be wrong, should I act on my convictions concerning my own personal behavior, and of course such that it does not harm anybody else, you know, while I'm doing what I'm doing? But should I adhere to my own conviction, or should I do it differently because society says so, or because the law says so? And I guess conversely would be, if the law says something is okay to do and I don't think it's okay to do, then I wouldn't do it, you know, because that's my conviction. It's not, you know, I wouldn't just do it or feel free to do it, you know, just because it's legal.
You know, I think the hard part comes when the law compels you to do something or forbids you to do something that you feel that you shouldn't do what's compelled, or that you have an obligation to do what's forbidden.
Yes, and Emerson, that's what I wondered, you know, and I think I was a libertarian when I read this stuff first, and that's kind of how I saw it, and it seemed like that. I think Emerson says that in a few places in here. He rebels against government coercion, so to speak, But getting back to the idea of believing in yourself or believing in your own thinking, he states here, this is in the opening first couple of paragraphs of the essay, the highest merit that we ascribe to Moses, Plato, and Milton is that They set at naught books and traditions, and spoke not what men, but what they thought. Here they spoke not what men, but what they thought. A man should learn to detect and watch that gleam of light which flashes across his mind from within, more than the luster of the firmament of bards and sages. And I think later on in the essay he mentions how all of humanity's great institutions were started by one thinker, or at least the religions were.
Yeah, he makes a reference to that, but getting back to what you were quoting, and that there's these great men are speaking their own thoughts. Well, I'm no biblical scholar, but I think that Moses was speaking what God told him, not what he thought, according to
what he
the
said.
Reports.
Well,
right.
according to what he said. But.
Right. So, I mean, we can make these attributions that all great men are speaking their own thoughts, but I think there's another school of thought that is along the line that we all build on the shoulders of our predecessors, and to say that it's original with us denies the input of previous thinkers.
Oh no, yeah, no, I agree, and but that's not how I read this. You know, when he says here that these guys set at naught books and traditions, to me, he's not saying that these guys didn't read or learn from history. That, of course, is all incorporated into our thinking. But whatever I conclude, or whatever they concluded about that, they were sure enough about it to write it down and teach it. And, of course, you know, people throughout the ages have read it and evaluated it and decided if they liked it or not, or agreed with it. And with more history under our belts, we may have changed our thinking. But the fact that these guys' ideas lasted for so long is, from what I'm seeing here, what Emerson is saying is that because they were firm in their belief and steadfast in speaking it, instead of being wishy-washy and oh, you know, maybe you're right, or you know, or being afraid to mention it at all for fear of ridicule, which is what what Emerson also mentions in here.
Yeah, I can see validity in that. On the other hand, later on in there, he talks about like Caesar is the foundation of the Roman Empire, and it's like the Roman Empire persisted not just because of Caesar, but of his successors and what they did to continue that and to change that as the empire went through time. It wasn't maintained in the same way that it was under Caesar. And he talks about Christ in the church, and yet from our discussion on a previous program, the church had a long history of debates within it and among the various factions as to what actually came out to what's the church today.
Right.
And so along the path of history, if a different faction had won out, it would be a different church today. And so in that sense, how much can we assert that the church today is the institution that Christ created, or that was founded on later people who attributed it to
right.
him?
Well, to me, that's the rub with Christianity, is that it did not really form with Jesus. He was a central character in the moral teachings that I get from at least the Gospels. But for instance, the Buddha, we can go back and read the translations of his stuff, the Tao Te Ching. You know, we can go back and read that, and of course the translations, you're never sure if they're totally reliable, but they were one man's thinking, were they not? Well, maybe not the Tao.
The Tao Te Ching, there's a dispute whether there was a group of people.
Right, but the Buddha, for instance, I mean, he's lasted today, till today. Of course, people have modified his views and all that, but you can go back and read his Four Noble Truths and everything else. And the power of what he did was because of him and his example. Mm-hmm. Of course, he made an impression on people, and that's what I'm getting from this here. It's not necessarily glorifying the individual all for himself, but entrusting him or herself.
Well, I can see to an extent that could be the case. But when he talks about history, I'm not sure I can lay my hand on that quote right away. Here it is, yeah. An institution is the lengthened shadow of one man. And that's where he refers to these different religious traditions. But this sentence ends with, all history resolves itself very easily into the biography of a few stout and earnest persons.
Mm-hmm.
And I think what we've been talking about in the last few minutes is how it's not those few individuals, but it's the impact that they had on a lot of other people and the impact those other people had on how that original tradition evolved through
Yes,
time.
right.
And so it's not just a few great individuals.
No, but they provided the founding stone, or the whatever, of the foundation which was built upon later on.
Well, yeah, in a sense, but there are often disputes among the various people who claim to be the ones carrying forward this original thinker's ideas, that they get into disputes among themselves, and it becomes questionable. Well, just what did the original teacher say?
Right. Well,
and
I think that's acknowledged. At least I acknowledge it throughout history. That's what happens with all human institutions. Once the individual founder is gone from the scene, it's wide open as to what it's going to become, because everybody's going to have their own take on it.
Yeah,
nobody was inside that person's mind.
Well, there's that, and then there's also the changes in the culture that this is being passed through. Like we were just talking about before the program, about trying to understand this essay itself, which was only written 100 and something years ago, 1841.
Yeah.
The changes in language, and then trying to understand what these words
mean. The word genius.
So what did he actually mean? Yeah. We're interpreting it through our understanding of the words he used, whereas back in 1841, a lot of these words, or a number of these words, were used in a different sense. And so we're not really even understanding what he said.
Yep, we got a call here. Hang on. Good evening. You're on the air with a pause for thought. Let me know who's calling, please.
I'm sorry, is this WHYR? I couldn't hear you.
Yes, this is WHYR. You're on the air. Did you want to be?
Oh, sure, yeah.
Do you know what we're talking about?
No, I don't.
Well, maybe you better listen then.
Yeah.
I don't want to have to repeat everything.
This is a call-in program.
Yeah, you're on a live call-in program.
Okay. I'm so sorry.
Oh, you didn't know. That's okay. Take it easy.
All right, man. Have a great day.
Well, that's interesting. Anyway, I'm looking at, and this is along the lines of the impression I got from most of what he says here. He says, my life is for itself and not for a spectacle. And what I must do is all that concerns me. What I must do is all that concerns me, not what the people think. Because you will always find those who think they know what is your duty better than you know it. And that resonates with me. He also says something interesting here, too. It says, it is easy in the world to live after the world's opinion. It is easy in solitude to live after our own. But the great man is he who in the midst of the crowd keeps with perfect sweetness and independence of solitude. So basically, if you can behave the way you really believe and the way you do act in solitude, if you can behave that way out in front of people, then you're going to have an impact one way or another. I suppose Charles Manson thought he was right and he had an impact, but I digress. Let's see, but assuming you have faith in your own understanding, are you trapped by that? He says that somewhere in here too, about being willing to change our thinking. That's one of the more famous quotes that people use that were attributed to him. He states here that a foolish consistency is the hobgoblin of little minds, adored by little statesmen and philosophers and divines. With consistency, a great soul has simply nothing to do. He may as well concern himself with his shadow on the wall. Speak what you think now in hard words, and tomorrow speak what tomorrow thinks in hard words again, though it contradict everything you said today. And he quotes here a statement, so you shall be sure to be misunderstood. And he states, well, is it so bad then to be misunderstood? Pythagoras was misunderstood, and Socrates, and Jesus, and Luther, and Copernicus, and Galileo. To be great is to be misunderstood. I'm not sure about that, but I agree with the idea of the consistency. Like when I quit the Libertarian Party because I outgrew it, I got calls from people everywhere. Apparently, I was somebody I didn't know, but they couldn't understand how I could leave it, how I could change, And I did the same thing with my religious beliefs. I finally realized, hey, I don't believe this anymore, and move on. I wasn't going to hold myself back and continue to profess something I no longer believed in,
Right.
And that's what I think he's saying here is don't be held back by that. Tomorrow's going to be a different day. You may learn something new.
Right. That's I think, wise advice. There's a question I have about his description of how to go about that. It's the sense I got out of here is like, well, assert with full-throated voice and with certainty that what you believe is the truth, as opposed to having more humility about your level of understanding of what the truth is and seeking out contrary perspectives to assist you in testing your sense of what the truth is and perhaps evolving your thinking.
I agree with that, Lang, and I wonder if there may be a distinction between believing firmly in what I believe and how I voice those things. I can always say them in a diplomatic way that would invite feedback and correction. But nevertheless, until shown otherwise, I have no choice but to believe what I believe.
Right. There's that aspect of how you present it in terms of seeking to evolve your own thinking. And then there's also, even if you firmly believe it and want to persuade others, there's a question of how to best present it in a way where it won't be rejected out of hand by the others from your high-toned sense of self-importance or whatever. And I don't see that spoken of here. My impression of the tone, and this may be just the difference in language in 1841 and language today, but my impression is that he's pretty dogmatic about
I got the impression
having a stranglehold on the truth.
Yes.
Having the truth.
I got that impression too, that he was he must have been an arrogant son of a gun. He sure did think he knew everything, I guess. But nevertheless, like I said, when I read him, I just took from it what it I made sense to me, I guess.
And touching on something we've covered in other programs about psychology as well, I think that there probably is a component of the biochemistry in your brain as to the way in which you express yourself and the level of certainty you feel about your beliefs. That sometimes you're more certain because you're in a different frame of mind.
That's true too. Yeah, we don't want to get too much into the weeds here, but I totally agree with that. But here again, there would be things that I would be absolutely adamant about. I believe firmly that we should help people who need help for whatever reason, even if they're a dissipated drunk or whatever. We should still help them if we encounter them. I'm not going to go out looking for people to throw money at or to give help to, but if I see somebody, okay, it's my lot to meet up with them, so I have to help them if they need it.
You're a brother's keeper.
Yeah, I see it that way, but Emerson definitely didn't see it that way in that regard. He speaks here almost with contempt of the almshouses and giving up, parting with $1 to give to some drunken sot or whatever, and that doesn't seem human to me. That's more along the lines of Ayn Rand's egoism, I think, which I no longer believe in, but it's kind of the same thing where it's all me and the world will benefit if I just be me. And even I wouldn't presume to think that, but anyway. And I haven't reminded anybody that this is a call-in show, although we did have a caller that enabled me to remind everyone, 343-9927, but don't call by accident. Okay, Lang, well, look in here. You have another bolded thought here from under your heading self-trust and transcendentalism. You say that in that deep force, the last fact behind which analysis cannot go, all things find their common origin. Do you have any idea what you were thinking of when you highlighted that?
Yeah, well, this is in the flow of one of his paragraphs about where the source of self-trust is. And he says, shortly before that, the magnetism which all original action exerts is explained when we inquire the reason for self-trust. What is this aboriginal self on which a universal reliance may be grounded? We call that spontaneity or instinct. We denote this primary wisdom as intuition. In that deep force, the last fact behind which analysis cannot go, all things find their common origin. That this primary wisdom of the true self, or the fundamental self that's behind all being, in a sense, it reminded me of in this discussion group about the Tao, it's like that which cannot be named. You can't get behind to discover what this universal original source of all being is.
Right.
And that's where this intuition or spontaneity, or what he talks about being in touch with what the truth is.
Right. And yeah, and I get that goes back to him, the way we've talked about the Tao Te Ching before, and how if we get our conscious mind out of the way, we can just be, and for lack of a better word, the universe will work its will through us. I mean, that's how I interpret what dancers and really talented musicians do when they're performing, is they're not thinking about anything. They're just, it's just coming out of them.
They're in the flow.
They're in the flow, right. And I wonder if that's what he was getting at there. There was a...
Yeah, well, later on in that same passage, he says, we lie in the lap of immense intelligence, which makes us receivers of its truth and organs of its activity.
When we discern justice, when we discern truth, we do nothing of ourselves but allow a passage to its beam. Yeah, how about that?
Yeah.
I wonder if that's where I got that that perspective originally, because I don't know. But
and I think that point of view lies behind this first quote that we started in the program with, to believe our own thought, to believe that what is true for you in your private heart is true for all men. If you believe that it all comes out of this source that's behind what we can actually get to, but it flows through us, then if you're in connection with that, and if there is that true source behind all things, then if that's where your truth is coming from, then that will be the truth for all.
Right, and I wonder, he mentioned somewhere in here that he does not adhere to any philosophy but to proximities. And I meant to look up the old definition of proximities, but I'm wondering if it's, the continuum idea or the blurriness of lines, like there is nothing, like the Tao Te Ching. There are two opposing forces everywhere, but each side has a piece of the other side. Nothing is 100% pure. Like we discussed human sexuality, that's on a continuum. There are very rarely people who are all one way or all the other. And maybe that's what he was getting at with your sense. It's a general thing. In general, it's true that people shouldn't be trying to kill each other or steal from each other. That's a universal belief, I think. And I'm guessing, of course, but that's how I see that anyway. But yeah, I think he's the one that also coined the phrase universal mind, but I don't recall ever reading that actually in any of his writings. I've just heard it attributed to him. Okay, well, we got a few minutes left here. Another thing I like is that he wrote here, if we live truly, we shall see truly. And I was thinking of a quote from Jesus in the Gospel of Thomas, one of the Gnostic Gospels. He said that, recognize that which is in your sight, and that which is hidden will become plain to you, for there is nothing hidden which will not become manifest. And the way I read that was, see things for what they are. Don't let your own interpretation or judgment affect you. And of course, you're smiling, but we can't always completely trust our perceptions. But in the moment, I don't see where we have much choice.
Yeah, well, our perceptions evolved to the state they're in because that's there to pass our genes on, and we evolved with what worked.
Yes, and as I've mentioned to you before, our perceptions and stuff can change a great deal with changes in our brain chemistry, depending on our youthfulness or whatever. But anyway, I guess we're about out of time, Lang. But I would like to thank everybody for listening. Hope you enjoyed Lang's and my ruminations, if that's the right word for it. I don't know. But you've been listening to Wayne Parker and Lang Baker here on A Pause for Thought on Baton Rouge Community Radio, 96.9 FM here in Baton Rouge. We got to go. We thank you for listening. Have a good night.
96.